Hello and welcome everyone. Today, we're diving into the gripping horror, mystery, and drama of the 2018 film Hereditary. Spoiler alert, so proceed with caution. The story begins with an eerie view of a treehouse in the backyard, setting a foreboding tone. Inside, we glimpse a workshop filled with intricate miniature models, one of which is an unsettling replica of the house and its inhabitants. Morning breaks, and Steve enters his son Peter's room to wake him for his grandmother's funeral, pausing to ask if Peter's sister slept in her own room the night before. With an air of unease, Steve heads outside to find the girl while Annie waits silently in the car, ready to depart, the tension already simmering beneath the surface. Steve finds Charlie curled up in the treehouse and scolds her for sleeping there, worried about her safety. At the funeral home, Annie delivers a poignant eulogy, describing her late mother as a deeply secretive and private woman, her voice tinged with a mix of grief and unease. Meanwhile, Charlie, seemingly detached from the solemnity of the moment, sketches Annie's portrait in her notebook until her father gently stops her. As curiosity pulls Charlie toward the open casket, she notices her grandmother's distinctive necklace and quietly observes mourners paying their respects. Her gaze lingers on a woman who performs an odd ritual, placing something on the deceased's lips before nonchalantly unwrapping a chocolate and eating it, adding a surreal touch to the somber scene. After the funeral, the family hurries to Charlie as she starts eating chocolate, anxiously asking if it contains nuts due to her allergy. Back home, they step into the quiet house, greeting their dog, Maxie. Annie, still grappling with her emotions, turns to Steve and asks if she should feel sadder, her uncertainty heavy in the air. Later, as Annie works meticulously on a miniature depicting her mother in hospice care, Steve checks in, their brief conversation tinged with an underlying tension. Upstairs, Peter strums his guitar in his room, lost in his own world, while Steve stops by to see him. Meanwhile, Annie enters Charlie's room, her attention caught by a haunting drawing of Charlie's late grandmother. Sensing her daughter's distress, Annie gently reassures her, softly reminding her that she was Grandma's favorite, trying to soothe the unspoken sorrow between them. Charlie confides in her mother about how protective her grandmother was and hesitantly asks who will care for her when her mother is gone. Annie reassures her that her father and brother will be there, but Charlie doesn't like the answer, her unease lingering. After their conversation, Annie retreats to her workshop, drawn to the boxes of her late mother's belongings. She sifts through family photos and a book on spiritualism, her heart sinking when she finds a cryptic note from her mother, pleading for forgiveness and promising that their sacrifice will be worth it. Shaken, Annie puts everything back, turns off the light, and freezes as a ghostly image of her mother looms in the corner, watching her in eerie silence. Startled, Annie quickly flips the light back on, only to find the room empty, leaving her questioning what she just saw. The next day, Charlie sits in her classroom, distracted and playing with a toy instead of focusing on her quiz. Her teacher calls her out, but her attention shifts as a bird crashes violently into the window. While the class reacts with shock, Charlie remains eerily unfazed, her gaze drifting toward the teacher's desk. Meanwhile, in another classroom, Peter is equally detached, bored and staring at a classmate's figure. His daydream is interrupted by a text from a friend, but before he can respond, the teacher calls him out for not paying attention. Peter glances over at Bridget, the girl he admires, only to catch her disappointed expression, adding a subtle sting to his already restless day. After class, Charlie lingers outside, fixated on the dead bird. Glancing around to ensure she's alone, she takes out a pair of scissors, severs the bird's head, and slips it into her pocket, unaware that someone is watching her from across the street. Later, Annie notices her late mother's bedroom door ajar. Uneasy, she steps inside to close it and notices a strange triangle etched into the floor. Suspicious, she asks Steve if he's been in the room, and though he denies it, they decide to lock the door, with Steve taking the key to ease her nerves. While Annie feels self-conscious about her growing paranoia, Steve's quiet understanding keeps her grounded. Meanwhile, Peter approaches his father, handing him the phone with an ominous message. The call is from the cemetery. Steve receives a call from the cemetery informing him that his mother-in-law's grave has been desecrated, but when Annie asks about it, he lies to spare her the distress. Later, Annie tells him she's going to see a movie, but instead, she secretly attends a grief recovery meeting. There, she opens up about the heavy burden of loss in her life: her mother's recent death, her father's tragic passing from psychotic depression when she was just a baby, and her older brother's suicide as a teenager, the result of his struggle with schizophrenia. With a strained voice, Annie reflects on her complex relationship with her mother, who had lived with her family before being moved to a hospice, painting a picture of a life overshadowed by grief and unresolved trauma. Annie reveals that she and her mother were estranged for years, but when they reconnected, her mother began exerting an unsettling influence over her daughter, leaving Annie riddled with guilt, especially after her mother fell ill. Annie feels like she's silently blamed for everything that went wrong. Meanwhile, Peter is in his room, getting high, when he receives a text from a friend inviting him to a party the next night. Unbeknownst to him, someone is watching him from outside. The next day, Charlie works on a project in her room but stops cold when she sees a ghostly apparition. Compelled by its presence, she ventures outside, clutching the severed bird's head. Reaching a secluded clearing, she freezes, staring in disbelief as a vision of her grandmother, eerily surrounded by flames, appears in the distance. While Charlie ventures into the clearing, Annie receives an email from the gallery planning to showcase her work, requesting a preview of her latest piece. Determined to focus, she heads to her workshop, but her thoughts are interrupted when Peter walks in, asking if he can borrow a car to attend a party. He assures her he won't drink, a promise she meets with skepticism, before insisting he take Charlie along. Reluctantly, Peter searches for his sister in her room, only to find it empty. Growing concerned, Annie begins looking for Charlie and eventually finds her in the clearing, barefoot and coatless. Frustrated and worried, she yells at her daughter for wandering outside unprotected, the tension between them simmering as the strange events continue to unfold. As Annie scolds Charlie for being outside barefoot, Charlie tearfully says she wants her grandma. Back inside the house, Annie informs her daughter that she'd be going to the party with Peter, despite Charlie's protests that she doesn't know anyone there. Turning to Peter, Annie firmly reminds him that, with Charlie tagging along, drinking is absolutely off the table. The siblings drive to the party, both sulking in mutual resentment. On the way, they pass a roadside pole etched with the same strange symbol from their grandmother's necklace, an ominous detail that goes unnoticed. At the party, Peter's mood lifts slightly when he spots Bridget, the girl he likes, while Charlie lingers uncomfortably in the background. Meanwhile, back at home, Annie immerses herself in her workshop, piecing together another intricate miniature model, seemingly oblivious to the unsettling threads weaving through her family's lives. Back at home, Annie gazes at the miniature of her mother, lost in thought, as the tension with her family builds. Meanwhile, at the party, Peter spots Bridget and, eager to impress, asks if she wants to smoke some weed with him. She directs him to another room where a bong waits, and as they head toward it, Peter notices Charlie quietly following them. Frustrated, he pleads with her to stay back and suggests she go get some cake to keep her distracted. Reluctantly, Charlie complies, but as Peter and Bridget join to others in the next room, Charlie sits alone in the main room, eating the cake. Soon, she begins to feel uneasy, her breath quickening. Bridget, in the other room, asks Peter about his sister, mentioning a disturbing drawing Charlie made of her. Meanwhile, Charlie sits by herself, still breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she continues to work on her project, her unease growing with each passing moment. Charlie stumbles into the room, gasping for air, her throat tightening as she struggles to breathe. Peter, sitting nearby and smoking weed, notices her distress and watches in horror as she tells him her throat is closing up, an allergic reaction from the nuts in the cake. Panic sets in as he quickly scoops her up and rushes her to the car, speeding toward the hospital. With every labored breath, Charlie can barely speak, and Peter reassures her, promising they're almost there. Desperate for relief, Charlie rolls down the window and sticks her head out, but in a tragic moment of sheer horror, Peter swerves to avoid an obstacle in the road. Before he can react, Charlie's head is violently torn off by a pole. He slams on the brakes, sitting in the car, frozen in complete shock, unable to comprehend what just happened. Peter, his heart heavy with grief, can't bring himself to look back at what happened. Tears stream down his face as he drives away, his mind reeling. When he finally reaches home, his parents hear him enter, but he says nothing. He silently walks to his room, lies down, and stares blankly at the ceiling, numb with shock. The next morning, still trapped in his own despair, Peter lies awake when he hears his mom's voice. She's preparing to leave, but moments later, his world shatters as he hears her agonizing wails upon discovering Charlie's body. That night, Annie's cries of anguish pierce the silence, her grief so overwhelming that she screams for her daughter, wishing she could die. Peter hears her sobs, powerless. The next day, they bury Charlie. At the wake, Peter isolates himself from everyone, standing behind a glass wall, unable to face them, while Annie lies motionless in her bed, consumed by her sorrow. After the wake, Steve quietly sends the remaining guests away, then walks into Charlie's room, where he begins flipping through her notebook, his mind heavy with grief. Meanwhile, Peter, still reeling from the accident, heads to bed, but as he lies there, he notices a strange red light flicker on in the treehouse. Peering out, he sees Annie, eerily asleep in Charlie's spot next to the heater, as if nothing has changed. The next day, Peter goes to school, but his mind keeps drifting back to the horrific events, unable to escape the memory of that night. Later, as he smokes weed with his friends to numb the pain, something begins to feel off. He suddenly feels the same sensation he had during the accident, as if his throat is closing up. His friends notice his struggle and try to calm him, but in a moment of panic, Peter reaches out, asking one of them to hold his hand, desperate for comfort as he faces the growing unease within him. Later, Annie, still grappling with her grief, considers attending another grief recovery meeting, but drives away in silence, unsure of what she's looking for. Just as she's about to leave, a woman flags her down, and Annie recognizes her as Joan, though she's hesitant to engage. Joan shares that she's been through immense loss herself, having lost her son and grandson just for months earlier, and that attending the meetings has provided her with some comfort. She offers Annie her phone number, just in case she needs someone to talk to. They say their goodbyes, and Annie drives home, where she finds Steve waiting for her. They lie down together, but when he reaches out to touch her, she pulls away, unable to stay in the bed with him, the weight of her grief pushing her further into isolation. Annie, restless and consumed by grief, tries to escape her own turmoil by retreating to her workshop, adding meticulous details to the miniature of Charlie's room. As she works, she remembers she needs to call the gallery, but in her distracted state, she accidentally spills paint on the paper where she had written Joan's phone number. Later, driven by a need to talk, she knocks on Joan's door. The woman greets her with warmth, inviting her inside. Annie, desperate to unburden herself, tells Joan about the horrifying moment she found Charlie's lifeless body in the car. As the conversation unfolds, Joan quietly takes a pill, then adds something mysterious to Annie's tea, the tension between them rising with each passing moment. Meanwhile, Steve, concerned for Annie's well-being, tells her it's too cold to sleep outside, but she remains distant, while Peter, staring at the eerie light in the treehouse, gets spooked by a strange presence in his room, though he sees nothing there. Joan, sensing Annie's deep pain, gently probes about her relationship with Peter, and Annie opens up, telling a haunting story from a few years ago when she nearly killed herself and her children while sleepwalking. She recalls how, in the midst of her sleepwalking, Peter woke up at the same time, screaming in terror. Despite her frantic pleas that it was just a sleepwalking episode, no one believed her, and Peter, unable to let go of that night, has held it against her ever since. No matter how much she tried to explain. Later, Steve, growing concerned, goes upstairs to check on Annie and finds her in her workshop, painstakingly crafting a miniature replica of the tragic accident. He is horrified by what she's doing, upset that she would create something so dark, especially fearing the day Peter might see it, further compounding the already fragile tension in their family. Annie defensively tells Steve that the miniature is simply a neutral representation of the accident, but Steve, growing more frustrated, tells her he came to get her for dinner, adding that he no longer cares if she joins them. Later, as they sit down to eat, Peter comments that the food is really good, but Annie snarls in response, the tension thickening. Peter, sensing the underlying animosity, asks if there's something she wants to say to him, initially trying to avoid confrontation. Annie eventually erupts into a rage, telling Peter that, despite understanding how much he's hurting, she can't forgive him for the accident, especially because he refuses to take responsibility for it. As her anger subsides, Peter, still seething, asks her why she can't own up to the fact that she pushed Charlie into going to the party, even though her daughter didn't want to go in the first place, flipping the blame back on Annie and deepening the rift between them. The argument between Annie and Peter escalates until Steve steps in, halting the fight, but Annie, seething with frustration, storms out of the house. Left behind at the dining table, Peter sits crying, unable to find solace, while Steve, helpless, watches his son's pain, unsure of how to console him. The next day, Annie tries to immerse herself in her work again, but instead finds herself walking aimlessly to the store to buy more art supplies. As she leaves the store, she unexpectedly runs into Joan, who greets her warmly. Sensing that something has shifted within Annie, Joan hesitates, unsure of how to tell her what's been weighing on her, worried that Annie might think she's crazy for what she's about to say. Despite her doubts, Joan opens up to Annie about her unsettling experience. She tells Annie about a seance she attended, where a spiritual medium performed a ritual that changed her perspective entirely. Initially skeptical, Joan was stunned when the medium came to her apartment and successfully conjured her grandson's spirit. Annie, of course, is skeptical and doesn't believe a word, but Joan insists that it was undeniably real. Determined to prove it, Joan convinces Annie to come with her to her place, where they sit at a table for another seance. Joan calmly instructs Annie on what to do, and as the ritual begins, Joan calls for her grandson's spirit, asking the ghost to move a glass on the table. When the glass slides, Annie panics, completely unnerved, but Joan remains focused, pushing the seance forward despite Annie's mounting fear. As the seance continues, the spirit communicates with Joan, the glass sliding across the table with increasing intensity, until, to Annie's shock, she feels the presence herself. Joan then produces a blackboard, and as the spirit moves, it begins to write on it. Annie, overwhelmed by the experience, begs Joan to stop, unable to handle the eerie connection any longer. Joan, understanding her fear, reassures her and offers instructions if Annie decides to try it on her own. She tells Annie to light a candle, then find something that belonged to Charlie to serve as a link to her spirit. When she's ready, Joan instructs her to read the words on the paper and warns that all the members of her family must be present in the house when she does, hinting at a ritual far deeper and darker than Annie could have imagined. Annie lies awake in bed, unable to sleep, when she notices ants crawling through the window, invading her space. Disturbed, she follows their trail, which leads her into Peter's room, where she finds them swarming all over him, covering his face in a nightmarish crawl. Just as panic sets in, Peter wakes her up, realizing she's sleepwalking. In her disoriented state, Annie, still gripped by fear, asks him if Charlie is there, but Peter, confused, questions why she's afraid of him. In a moment of vulnerability, Annie blurts out that she never wanted to be his mother. It was a role forced upon her by her own mother. She admits, with painful honesty, that she even tried to end the pregnancy to avoid the responsibility, but despite everything, she's thankful it didn't work, a conflicted mixture of guilt and relief lingering in her words. Peter breaks down in tears, asking Annie why she tried to kill him, to which she responds, with heartbreaking sincerity, that she was actually trying to save him. In a burst of emotion, she suddenly bursts into flames, and just as everything seems to spiral out of control, Annie wakes up, gasping in her bed. Still shaken, she stumbles into the bathroom and whispers the words from the paper that Joan had given her. Determined, Annie heads to Peter's room, wakes him up, and apologizes for everything, urging him to come downstairs so they can try something together. She then wakes Steve and gathers them both in the dining room. With an air of quiet desperation, Annie brings the table closer, takes their hands, and tells them to focus on Charlie. Steve, angry and confused, lashes out at her, but Annie calmly declares that she's a medium and that she can show them, setting the stage for something far darker and more unsettling than any of them anticipated. Peter reluctantly agrees to stay, and after some convincing, Steve does as well. Annie, focused and determined, asks for Charlie's presence, her voice steady as she concentrates. Suddenly, Peter hears something behind them, and Annie urges them to place their hands on the glass, asking Charlie to move it. As the glass shifts, Peter feels an eerie, inexplicable sensation, his fear growing as the glass moves on its own. Annie then asks Charlie to draw something for her, but Peter, visibly terrified, starts to panic. Steve, trying to keep the situation under control, slams the sketchbook shut, but Annie shows him a previous drawing Charlie had made, a chilling reminder of the connection. Overcome with emotion, Peter begins to cry, and suddenly, something in the background crashes. The candle flames burst upward, then mysteriously relight themselves. Steve, increasingly alarmed, checks under the table and hears the unsettling sound of Annie's breath, labored and unnatural, sending a wave of dread through the room. Annie suddenly begins speaking in a child's voice, and Peter, terrified, watches as she acts as if she's possessed by Charlie, asking for her mom in a way that's both eerily familiar and disturbing. Unable to stop her, Steve desperately throws water over Annie, breaking the trance, and she wakes up confused, with no memory of what happened. That night, Peter lies awake, unable to shake the fear that has consumed him. The next day, in class, he is startled when he sees an apparition that no one else notices. When he glances at his reflection in a bookshelf, it smiles back at him, a twisted version of himself. As the dread deepens, he hears a popping sound, one that reminds him of Charlie's unsettling noises, sending a wave of panic through him. Later, while Annie is working, she receives a phone call from Steve, who tells her that Peter has called him, claiming there's a vengeful ghost after him. The conversation quickly escalates into an argument, and Steve hangs up on her. The phone rings again, but Annie lets it go to voicemail, only to hear a man from the gallery leave a message, asking if they can help her in any way. Frustrated, she takes her anger out on the models in her workshop, violently destroying them. When Steve and Peter return home, they immediately notice a strange, unsettling smell in the house. Steve goes to check on Annie, asking about the odor, and when he sees the wreckage of the models, she simply tells him that she didn't feel like looking at them anymore, her voice flat and distant. That night, Steve notices a disturbing detail in the model of their bedroom as headless miniature, a chilling omen of what's to come. Deciding he can't sleep there, he opts for the couch. Meanwhile, Annie is in their room when she hears something coming from Charlie's room. She enters and finds the sketchbook drawing itself, as if possessed by an unseen force. In the dead of night, Peter is jolted awake by the same unsettling popping sound that Charlie used to make. He looks toward the corner of his room and is horrified to see Charlie standing there. As he calls for her, her head suddenly detaches and rolls away like a ball. Maxie, the family dog, growls at the door, sensing something is wrong when out of nowhere, something grabs him from behind, violently pulling his head off. In the eerie silence of the house, the door slams shut in Maxie's face just as Annie appears in Peter's room. Peter, still shaken, asks her why she was pulling his head off, to which Annie calmly replies that she wasn't and warns him not to tell his father. She insists that she knows what's happening and is the only one who can stop it. Later, Annie returns to Charlie's room and finds disturbing drawings of Peter in the sketchbook. Desperate to destroy them, she tries to burn the book in the fireplace, but as it catches fire, her arm suddenly ignites. Frantically, she pulls the book out of the flames, and her arm stops burning. The next day, determined to find answers, Annie goes back to see Joan. When Annie arrives at Joan's apartment, there's no answer, but the space reveals unsettling signs that Joan may have been in contact with Charlie. Meanwhile, at school, Peter hears his name being called and turns to see Joan across the street, urging him to leave. Disturbed, Annie returns home and finds another book in her mother's box, marked with the same symbol as her grandmother's necklace. As she flips through it, she discovers a section on invocations, with a paragraph her mother had underlined detailing an invocation ritual that requires a male host. Continuing to search, Annie goes through another family album and uncovers pictures of Joan, as well as her mother performing strange rituals. While at school, Peter sees another light apparition that seems to guide him to a door, where someone on the other side gestures for him to enter. Meanwhile, Steve tries to send an email to a psychiatrist about his wife, but is interrupted by one from the cemetery, detailing damages to a grave. At the same time, Annie opens the attic door, and a terrible stench fills the air. As she ventures up, she discovers the body of her mother, with the same symbol written on the wall. Back at school, Peter struggles to concentrate, haunted by the persistent popping sound echoing around him. Peter hears the popping sound behind him, then in front, and suddenly his body seems to be overtaken by something, leaving his teacher and classmates in shock. He slams his head on the table, then again, breaking his nose, his panic escalating as he struggles to understand what just happened. At home, no one answers when the school calls, and Steve receives the call at work, rushing to pick up Peter. Annie waits anxiously at home, helping Steve drag Peter out of the car as he shakily recounts the terrifying incident. As they help Peter into bed, Annie pleads with Steve to check if her mother's body is upstairs, convinced it's her, but when he returns, he tells her the head is missing. He questions why she didn't call the police, and Annie begins to explain everything about Joan and what she believes her mother was involved in. Steve, however, accuses Annie of being the one who dug up the body. Desperately, Annie insists that they've brought a curse upon themselves after summoning Charlie, and that Peter is now in grave danger. She tells him about the book, sharing her belief that she's somehow connected to it, but Steve remains skeptical and confused. Annie desperately pleads with Steve to trust her, telling him that if they don't destroy the sketchbook, Peter will die. As they descend the stairs, she begs him to throw it in the fire, telling him that he's the love of her life, as if saying goodbye. But Steve refuses, believing she's lost her mind. In a final act of desperation, Annie grabs the sketchbook and throws it into the flames. Instantly, the fire engulfs her, and she bursts into flames. A strange light apparition flows over her, and she transforms into someone else. Later that night, Peter wakes up in his bed, seeing the eerie light glowing in the treehouse. He calls for his parents, but there's no answer. Peter gets up and notices the lights outside flicker on, followed by something crawling behind him. Stepping cautiously into the dark house, he hears unsettling noises and slams his grandma's door shut before walking down the hallway, passing a miniature of their house. In the living room, he finds his father's lifeless body. As he turns around, he hears another noise and sees Annie lurking from the ceiling. He quickly turns in the other direction, only to find a naked figure in the shadows. Panic sets in as Annie suddenly begins chasing him up the stairs. In a desperate attempt to escape, Peter hides in the attic, pleading for her to stop and apologizing. Peter hears pounding at the attic door, which suddenly stops. Calling out to his mother, he scans the attic and discovers it's been set up for some kind of ritual, with him as the centerpiece. Believing he's trapped in a nightmare, he tries to wake himself up, but his eyes fall on his mother, who is cutting off her own head. To his horror, He sees more naked elderly figures around her. Panicking, Peter leaps out of the window, and a sickening sound of a head falling echoes from above. The light apparition enters his body, and he wakes up, only to see his mother's headless body floating toward the treehouse. As he mimics Charlie's old popping sound, Peter follows her, noticing the naked onlookers hiding in the bushes. When Peter reaches the treehouse, he is confronted by a chilling scene. Many people gathered around, including his mother and grandmother's bodies, all bowing to his sister's head mounted on a mannequin. The air is thick with dread as Joan approaches him, placing a crown on his head. She speaks to him, or rather to Charlie, assuring him that she is finally at peace. Joan reveals the truth. Charlie is not Charlie at all, but Payman, one of the kings of hell. They had summoned him from the depths, offering themselves to him in a dark and twisted ritual.